The storm rolled across the mountains like a living thing, a dark, breathing presence that moved with purpose. Lightning braided the sky and struck the peaks, casting brief, jagged shadows over the temple roofs. In the courtyard, a young Shaolin monk named Jin stood alone, rain tracing lines across his shaved head, fists clenched so tight the knuckles shone pale against his skin. He breathed hard, each inhale an impatient drumbeat, each exhale a promise he could not yet keep. 3 of his brothers stepped into the space around him, forming a careful triangle. They were not enemies. They were protectors, the kind that arrived at the edges of proud recklessness. Their faces were familiar from early morning training and late-night meditation. They moved with the measured calm of those who had learned to let the world pass through them without disturbance. Tonight, they had come to stop Jin. He had been restless for months. Faster than anyone in his class, a prodigy of motion, he learned physical forms in days, refined kicks and strikes in weeks, and shattered wooden posts that left others doubting the solidity of their own arms. Discipline, patience, stillness, those waited for him at the other side of time, and Jin felt that time as an affront. Where others nurtured a slow and deliberate growth, he wanted the world now. He wanted recognition, the thrill of being seen, the rush of applause, the proof that his speed meant something beyond the quiet stones of the temple courtyard. Master Shen, old as the highest cedar and steady as the mountain itself, watched Jin in ways that looked like gentleness. One night, when Jin's shadow lingered on the wall long after the others had retired, the master had said softly that storms which moved too quickly never saw the trees they destroyed. The words were a bowl of cool tea on a fevered tongue, meant to temper the heat of ambition. Jin bowed with the practiced politeness of duty, but his pride hummed like a spring on the verge of bursting. He did not see himself as a storm. He saw lightning, brilliant and immediate, a line of brilliance that cut through darkness. Training at the temple was arranged by elements: fire for speed, water for flow, air for balance, earth for endurance. Each element was a lesson in both motion and restraint, a way of moving through the world that respected limits and honored timing. Under fire, they sprinted across wet stones, leaping from pillar to pillar, each landing a whisper. Jin dominated these drills. His leaps were near perfect, his footfalls barely audible on the slick stone. Underwater, they practiced defensive forms, techniques designed to let force pass through or around the defender like a river around a rock. Jin forced each motion with edges and sharpness, wanting to overpower the current rather than be carried by it. Master Shen watched the rigidity and offered a quiet correction: water does not fight, it moves. Jin nodded without changing course. Air demanded balance. Students walked narrow beams blindfolded, the courtyard below a blur of distant tiles and dripping eaves. Jin hurried, impatient with each step, slipping once and catching himself with a grim, embarrassed composure. He pretended the misstep never happened. Earth was unglamorous endurance, hours in horse stance, breath slow, body still. While the others trembled with the quiet ache of holding, Jin trembled louder, each moment of stillness a small war waged within him. He could not tolerate the patience required to hear his own breath. The announcement arrived like a ripple from the valley. A traveling martial troupe, dazzling crowds with performances and offering contests to worthy challengers, would pass through the nearby towns. Students buzzed. Teachers watched. Jin's heart lit like a lantern. This was the chance he had been bracing for, a stepping stone from monastery stone to the muddy, roaring life outside, where names mattered and the world was hungry for new legends. Master Shen's answer was a soft stone in a rushing stream. No one leaves the mountain, he decreed. Training is not finished. The edict balanced on the same principle that guarded the monastery: discipline, mastery, the patient earning of permission. Most bowed and accepted the path. Jin's jaw clenched in a permanent knot. The drumbeat in the courtyard matched the rising turbulence in his chest. That night, while the moon hid and most of the temple slept, Jin packed in silence. He folded his robe with the care of habit, looped his prayer beads so they hung over his wrist, and tucked away ambition like a coiled blade. He moved toward the gate, driven by a line of longing far stronger than caution. He had come too far to be turned back by a rule that felt like a tether. 3 figures intercepted him beneath the eaves at the gate, his brothers. They stepped not to obstruct but to protect. They spoke with the intensity of those who had seen the subtle destruction of untempered talent. Their hands rose in gestures of appeal and restraint, smooth and open rather than threatening. They asked him to stay, to train, to finish what had been started. They reminded him of the shame that left a monk at the wrong moment, the pride that unmade discipline, the chaos that followed the unready. Lightning carved the sky as Jin shook his head, the decision like a rock dropped into a still pool. Rain began to fall in sheets, turning the yard into a mirror of dark water and making every movement a study in slipperiness. They raised their hands to restrain. Jin raised his fists to break free. The drum sounded, old and resonant, and the courtyard became an arena not of hatred but of an important intervention. What followed was a fight with no enemy. It was action compressed into a lesson, clean, controlled, cinematic. Jin moved first with the precise arrogance of a young fighter convinced the world was a stage for his talent. He launched a spinning kick, all kinetic poetry in the rain, but the first brother redirected his leg mid-air with a gentle guiding hand that turned power into harmless motion. Another slid behind with soft footwork and slipped a hand behind Jin's ankle, unbalancing him without force. The third stepped forward, palm open and steady like a placid surface, reminding him that this night was not about hurting but about halting. Jin's pride roared. He chained combos at a breathless pace, elbows, sweeps, forward surges, each strike missing intention by a hair because speed without timing is a broken tool. His brothers met him with precision, not blocks that bruised but parries that taught, redirects that spoke, light taps that showed openings, foot sweeps that stopped just shy of contact. They were teachers with bodies, sculpting understanding from momentum. The choreography was deliberate, teach, not punish. On wet stone, Jin slipped. He caught himself, breath ragged, and rage flared so bright it nearly blinded him. He lunged, pushing harder. This time, the brothers stepped aside. No counters. No blocks. They simply let him continue his line of motion until the only possible outcome was to fall. He hit the ground hard enough to knock the breath from his chest, but not to harm, and lay staring skyward as the storm slowed around him. The drum faded to a distant thud. When Jin finally looked up, Master Shen stood over him, an unmoving presence like the mountain itself. There was no scolding, no thunderous reprimand. The master knelt with the same softness he had shown for 1,000 small failures. He explained, not with harshness but with the gravity of someone who had seen storms make landscapes uninhabitable. This had been Jin's test, the master said, not the 3 brothers, not the traveling troupe, but Jin himself. The courtyard, with its slick stones and echoing walls, was where storms found the limits of their own power. For years, the master continued, Jin had chased the world beyond the gates, a world that would take his speed and demand wisdom. Until he mastered the world inside, he would only bring chaos wherever he went. The words landed like rain. The master helped Jin sit, guided breath to slow, and spoke a lesson that cut through the residue of arrogance. Speed is nothing without timing. Power is nothing without restraint. Victory is nothing without wisdom. Jin closed his eyes and listened in a way he had not before. He listened to the rain as if it were an answer. He listened to the beating of his heart and the shifting of his breath. For the first time, stillness did not seem empty. It seemed like a teacher with an unhurried voice. When he opened his eyes, the storm outside the temple was the same, but within him something had shifted. There was no longer a tempest. There were his brothers, the master, the courtyard, family and structure, and a path he had not yet seen. In the days that followed, training took on a different hue. Elemental drills, fire, water, air, earth, became not boxes to check but conversations between body and breath. On the firestones, Jin learned to time his leaps not to impress but to land with purpose. He discovered that silence between movements carried as much weight as the motion itself. Under the water forms, he practiced yielding, learning that allowing force to pass did not make one weak, but rather preserved energy and revealed openings born of patience. On the air beam, blindfolded and slow, he learned to trust the center of his body, feeling balance as a place rather than a reaction. In the horse stance, he stayed until the tremor of unease settled into stillness, and in that aching quiet he learned to hear the rhythm of his own breath as a metronome. The brothers who had stopped him became, in time, his teachers in ways that outranked physicality. They taught him the art of restraint through small, persistent acts: a hand held to stop a strike, a foot placed to redirect a charge, eyes that read intention and diffuse it. They offered challenge with compassion, pushback with patience. In moments of temptation, when Jin's thoughts drifted again toward the bright lights of the valley, one of them would meet his gaze, an unspoken reminder of what had been learned on the stone. The temple's rule, earn the right to leave, was not a punishment but a covenant. Leave unready, and the world would not only refuse to be impressed, it would wound. There were nights when doubt crept back in. Jin would stand at the wall, not to plot an escape, but to measure himself against the sky. Lanterns in distant villages glowed like a possible future, but the longing in his chest had mellowed. He no longer wanted the world merely to take note of him. He wanted to be worthy of being seen. That subtle change was the difference between vanity and humility, between taking and preparing. Master Shen continued to weave quiet lessons into daily life. Sometimes they came in stories about long-ago monks who had traveled and returned humbled and wise. Sometimes they arrived as single, direct corrections: a foot adjusted, a breath guided, a palm placed. The master never forbade ambition, but he made an alliance with responsibility. He taught that leaving the temple was not an exit but a continuation, a new phase that demanded the discipline cultivated in years of quiet repetition. To go out was to carry the monastery's heart into the world, and that heart needed to be steady. Months ripened into seasons. Jin's speed remained a defining trait, but it was now tempered with the art of timing. He began to weave motion and stillness into patterns that made his technique look effortless. Where before his movements shouted, they now whispered, carrying the force of restraint. He practiced forms so carefully that even when he moved fast, there was a sense of inevitability, each action the consequence of a patient cause. Power met purpose. Strength met timing. And in the softness between motions, he found an unexpected taste of contentment. When the troop finally arrived and passed near the village, the temple watched as it always had, with steady, detached interest. Some students traveled to observe, to learn from unfamiliar styles. Jin watched from the wall without envy. He observed, not to borrow applause, but to understand how different energies moved through different spaces. The world beyond the gate had not lost its charm. It had simply become a place for which he felt better prepared. On nights when wind crept through the courtyards and lightning still sketched the mountains, Jin no longer aimed his gaze outward to escape. He stood and looked up into the sky, finding calm in its vastness. The tempest of his youthful impatience had settled into a clearer current. There remained a future for him beyond the temple gates, but it was no longer something to seize at the expense of readiness. He wanted to be worthy of being seen, worthy of the world he aspired to join. Master Shen's blessing remained unspoken but felt. In the quiet gestures of everyday life, the passing of a cup, the correction of a stance, the patient guidance when speed wanted to overrun judgment, Jin received approval that meant more than any immediate triumph. The day would come, the master hinted, when Jin would step beyond the gates with the weight of the temple's teachings on his shoulders and the lightness of his own assuredness in his step. Until then, the courtyard received the sound of footsteps and breath, of wood and stone and rain and laughter, all braided into a rhythm that measured growth more faithfully than applause ever could. Jin practiced. He stumbled. He rose. He watched the lanterns from the wall without fever. He learned to move like a river, swift where necessary, patient where needed, always directed by the bedrock beneath. In the end, the temple's lesson was not about denying ambition. It was about molding it so that it served a broader purpose. Jin's journey from lightning to something steadier was not a loss of spark, but a widening of power's definition. Speed remained a gift, but it was now a tool wielded with intention. When he finally did leave, it would not be to announce power. It would be to carry the discipline that made power into something that could heal, protect, and endure. That night in the rain lived in Jin's memory as a hinge. It marked the moment when motion stopped being a refuge for impatience and became a language of wisdom. The storm still rolled over the mountains from time to time, but Jin was no longer only the lightning that struck and vanished. He had learned to become something that listened, to breath, to posture, to quiet. He had learned that the world outside asked not only for talent, but for readiness. When the time came for him to walk past the gate, it would be with a calm that the storm could not unsettle, because he had learned, finally, to be worthy of being seen.